So we just looked into how linguistics would make periodic resets somewhat impractical. And we use historical accounts of words like chow and their origins and effect on other cultures to illustrate the point. So now we have an interview with a university professor who is an expert on historical linguistics. But before I play the interview, I just wanted to let everyone know that I was not given permission to use this professor's voice or his name. So I had to use an AI voice to represent the professor. I'm always respectful to the wishes of my sources. And before we begin, I just wanted to add a quick word about how this relates to mind control, and that one of the methods of this, being mind control, is to convince someone of an alternate reality, and then to tell them that that alternate reality was wrong, and then convince them that another lie was reality. If you do that enough times with someone, like convince them that the sun is green, for example, and then tell them it was wrong, and then convince them that the sun was actually blue, things like that will cause them to disassociate. And to some extent, that may be the case with conspiracy theories that are arguably flawed, perhaps on purpose. Who knows? Maybe they're accurate. I don't know. But it's certainly a concern. It's a valid concern. So, because once you learn that this reality is a lie, and then you learn the conspiracy theory was also a lie, like a fake conspiracy theory, that is a method of mind control. And that so it goes with the rest of this theme. And that is one of the concerns I have about things like the mud flood theory. I don't know, it could be accurate, I don't know, but I have a valid concern. So with that said, I recorded this interview on my phone and then meticulously had to copy the lines into AI to bring you this representation of that interview in this format. So, and this is an interview I had with a reputable university professor on historical linguistics. So that said, let's all give a virtual welcome to a professor from an undisclosed university. Welcome to the Nut House, Professor. I appreciate you taking the time to allow me to interview you today.
The pleasure is all mine, Peanut.
So, question number one. What is historical linguistics and how does it work?
So, historical linguistics is the study of language change, the scientific study of language change. So how languages change, what causes change, what sorts of changes are possible, and what sorts of changes don't seem to occur. And it also includes such things, such as what we would call language reconstruction. So if you are trying to figure out the prehistory of languages, how they were evolving before they got written down, that's also part of historical linguistics. Basically, anything involving language change.
So, is that the method that was used to reconstruct Proto Indo European, something like that?
That is correct. Yeah. So that included things like the comparative method, which is a fairly simple thing. It basically means that if you get two languages that are similar in various ways, and you want to find out why they are similar that way, there are a couple of various reasons for that. It could be that one language has borrowed from the other language, like English has gotten words from Latin or French. It could be due to chance. It could be due to a couple of different factors that we call language universals that cause certain kinds of words to look similar, probably across a lot of related languages. Or it could be the languages descended from a common ancestor. So you try to rule out the other possible sources of similarity before you conclude that the reason for the similarities is that they have a shared common ancestor. And once you decide that that is the reason for the similarities, then you can look more closely at the similarities and use them kind of like common denominators to reconstruct their common ancestor. That is just very briefly, a quick explanation.
How can historical linguistics be used in a similar way to archaeology in recovering the past?
Yeah, so language is not spoken in a vacuum, right? It's spoken by people, and people live in a particular society and culture, and so forth. And language, in varying degrees and in various ways, reflects the culture of the people that speak it. So if you have a lot of information that you can use to reconstruct a prehistoric ancestral language to some language family, and you are able to reconstruct lots of vocabulary, and maybe you got more. As in the case of the Europeans, you have fairly rich literary traditions, and these different languages that share certain features of religious practice and literary style, and various things of that nature. All of those are things allow you to put flesh on bones, as it were. See things about the vocabulary that was used by these folks, and what that vocabulary might reflect culturally or geographically about where they lived. such as terms like flora and so forth. Try to use that as a way of figuring out where on earth they were, or reconstructed terms for technical logical things like wheels or whatever. And all of that kind of information can then be brought together, and all these hypotheses about the culture or society of this certain people can then be combined with archaeology. And archaeological information can then tell you whether what you've got like archaeological sites that might match in certain ways or be consistent with those sorts of reconstructions that are based purely out of linguistic material.
Can historical linguistics be used to discover, say, the geographical location from where a group of people came from?
T can be used as one piece of information about that. It probably could if you had enough detailed information about that. Probably a fairly specific location where a prehistoric population lived. I'm not so familiar with that question in regards to other language families besides Proto-European. For the Indo-European families, the information we have is really not quite specific enough to make those kinds of determinations purely on its own. And that is why he have to use her parallel sorts of methods and disciplines like archaeology and genetics and so forth to see if the information that we got from those different disciplines all kind of converge on the same homeland or the same migration patterns or whatever.
What kinds of things can historical linguistics tell us about things like the domestication of the horse in history?
So let me think for a second. I'm not sure. Well, it kind of depends on what you've got. So, you can reconstruct the word for horse for Proto-European, but that doesn't specify if that is for a domestic horse. It's just a word for horse. So that alone doesn't tell us whether for the Proto-Europeans, if the horse was a domesticated animal or just something, from the environment. If you have other information, like let's say you can reconstruct words for bridle and for saddle, and for various gear that goes with domesticated horses, or some vocabulary that had to do with horse breeding or the like, then you would have a much stronger case for being able to say that the horse was domesticated. We don't have vocabulary of that particular nature, domesticated horses. That once again is an area where archaeology would be able to be of help, and through archaeology we would be able to determine which prehistoric sites were inhabited by folks that had horses, had domesticated horses. Even that is not entirely clear, so there can be ambiguities. You can find horse remains in proximity to human remains and remains of human settlements. And that doesn't necessarily mean that humans were keeping them as domesticated animals. Often they would just use them for food. So you have to look at things like micro-wear on the teeth of the horses to show that they had a bridle in their mouths. And evidence forms skeletons. There is skeletal evidence from early humans you can use to see if they spent a lot of time sitting on the saddle, for instance, because that changes your skeleton a little bit. So those kinds of things are archaeological matter and not linguistic matters. Again, theoretically you can have a language family where the languages have inherited words for saddle and so forth that you can posit for their ancestor. We just don't have that idea from that.
If a bunch of powerful elite people came together and decided that they wanted to erase the entire history of the Roman Empire from the memory of the world, like to pretend that the Roman Empire never existed, how would historical linguistics be a hindrance to that cover up?
Well, you would have to erase all traces of the language that the Romans spoke, Latin right, and all the texts that they wrote down, and all the mentions of the empire of those texts that they would have to completely obliterate all of that. As you know, Latin has descent languages of today, the Romance languages, French, Spanish, and so forth. So those languages in and of themselves don't carry the information that their ancestor, that Latin speakers had an empire, but it certainly carries the information that there was a language that we call Latin that was their ancestor. So, by erasing all traces of written Latin, you could still recreate the language at least to some extent, and you just wouldn't understand the context, I suppose, in which it was spoken, or as much about the people who spoke it if you got rid of all of the physical evidence of them.
What about borrow words like Tsar in Russia and Kaiser in Germany, which come from the word Caesar? Wouldn't that be the historical linguistic reminders that would refer back to the fact that the ancient Roman Empire did indeed exist?
Yeah, they would. They would be. The only thing is if they had absolutely no knowledge of the Roman Empire and the names of the rulers and that kind of thing, you wouldn't really know what these words, you wouldn't know that Caesar was once a personal name of a ruler of an empire, right? I'm not sure. Again, I'd have to think about it. Maybe there's a word in the Romance languages that tell you that for sure, but I'm not sure if any of the vocabulary would on its own tell you that that this particular people had anything other than a relatively advanced civilization, right? Because obviously there are words for all different kinds of material goods and technological objects and so forth that you can reconstruct for that people. It just wouldn't tell you politically all that much. Or geopolitically, I think.
What about other cultures that wrote about Rome?
Yes, sure. Imagine that having to obliterate the Roman Empire would really take a lot of work. There isn't two ways about it. I don't if you again, in this imaginary world where this is possible, you're right. You have to also obliterate not just traces of Latin itself, but all of the writings about the Roman Empire by other peoples. All the traces of Greek inscriptions and Greek texts. And not just Greek, but there's some other languages and other folks that wrote about the Romans that obviously had relations with the Romans and from texts and from trade and treaties, and you would have to get rid of all that stuff. So that is a lot of material.
How possible would that be, in your opinion?
Probably impossible short of obliterating, short of a true annihilation of the physical landscape of much of Western Europe and Asia and elsewhere now, of course. The texts are all over the globe and libraries and so forth. You would have to get rid of every one of those things. And I don't know that you can do that short of massive thermonuclear war or something.
Right. You'd have to wipe out like a complete civilization.
And maybe if I sat down and thought long and hard enough, maybe there are some words in no smoking guns in the vocabulary of the modern Romance languages that descended from Latin that could in fact be a strong indicator that the ancestors of people had an empire.
So, in theory, it might be possible to reconstruct the idea that there once was a Roman Empire based upon the evidence left behind in the Romance languages?
Yeah, yeah, in theory you could. I don't know if, like I said, the Caesar example isn't necessarily a good enough example. But there might be others, and I am not a specialist on the Romance languages, and I can't, conveniently scroll through a list in my head of all the different words that are inherited from Latin. But I would imagine that among them, given what I do know, there might be enough that could at least strongly indicate the possibility. Some of the vocabulary that was in Latin came from somewhere, came as a result of imperial fashion. So you could theoretically connect that through linguistic remains of those other language that are spoken today from those particular regions. Okay, it would just depend on the path of the. But in theory it would be possible. Yeah.
So, if a literate society like ancient China lived next to an advanced culture like what people imagine Atlantis to be like, how likely would it be that China did not mention this advanced culture in their writings?
That is entirely dependent on factors that are not linguistic in nature, so I would not be able to really comment on that. There could be any number of reasons why a culture would not mention something. They could be under a strict rule in this particular culture. They could be under some strict rule not to say anything, or breathe a word about them and they followed that, or I don't know, you can just imagine something. Those are things that purely you can think of just in the realm of speculation. There's all kinds of reasons cross-culturally and cross-linguistically why particular things, particular people, particular objects are not mentioned by name. For instance, there are lots of examples of this under a variety of different circumstances across the globe. So you can imagine something of that nature. It's probably unlikely though, depending on what the nature of the contact was and how the Chinese interpreted it. Was this a one-time thing where they saw this amazing demonstration of technology? Did they have a process and interpret this around their own framework? So it gets mentioned in ways that are kind of opaque. Or later scholars, or did they have hundreds of years of contact with this civilization and it went well and yada yada yada. Again depending on the sort of initial conditions there, the likelihood could go up or go down. If it would mention that in a way which would be understandable to us.
Is there a way using historical linguistics to tell if tribes of Turks and Mongols living in that area of Asia were nomadic peoples or not?
I don't know. But probably, ultimately, again, if you had a rich enough amount of vocabulary that you can reconstruct for the relevant ancestral language that was indicative of that particular kind of lifestyle. So, we think for instance that the Proto-Indo-Europeans were pastoralists. And we base that on a combination of the linguistic evidence, their reconstructed vocabulary. Let's see now. Pastoralist in nature and what we know about early Indo-European societies. So it's kind of a combination of real-world knowledge and linguistic knowledge. And so if you had enough of that for the Turks and the Mongols, in theory you could make claims about the more or less plausible claims about the Proto-Turkic and Proto-Mongolic, which may or may not have been related. By the way, there's a controversy over that.
Is there a way to create false linguistics to cover up history or create a substitute history?
You can try to fake anything, but I don't know how successful you will be. I can't really think of that kind of thing as having ever been tried. Given archaeology and anthropology, there have been fakes as well as other things. Felt down man from the 1920s or 30s, which turned out to be a fake prehistoric human skull. Things like that. I suppose somebody could try to, fake an inscription in some previously unknown language and do something with it. in theory, but I don't know that they would be successful.
Professor, what I am thinking is that language is organic and it is so complicated because it would be like impossible to fake history. Because if you had to change the history of a word in just one language, it would affect all the other borrowed words in other languages around it, right?
Well, to create a language right, people do that all the time. You can create a European language so easily, at least on paper, and people have done stuff like that, kind of for fun sometimes, but it's just a question if you can get people to believe it's a real thing. And that's a completely different matter, and that's extremely difficult for me to imagine, because it would involve, archaeological sites and archaeological digs and whatever would uncover these things. That kind of stuff.
What is the one most important thing that you want anyone to know about historical linguistics who has no idea at all what this topic is? What would you tell them? What do you think is important for them to know?
I think that it's important to know that it's a very reliable method to start talking specifically about comparative linguistics reconstructive stuff. We're talking about, well, I'll say two things. One, that it is extremely reliable to uncover the past information about the human past. That is done with help from other methods. And it's been tried and tested for a good 2 centuries now. So that's one thing. And so as linguistics goes, it is as important as any other part of understanding ourselves, right? So how is it that one of those integral features of humanity, language, how does it evolve and how does it change?
Professor, I know you have to go. Your time is limited, so I just wanted to thank you again for taking the time to allow me to interview you here today.
You are welcome, Mike. And if you have any further questions for me, you are welcome to send me an email.
So that concludes my interview with a university professor of historical linguistics. If anyone has any questions you would like me to ask the professor, please let me know in the comment section of this video, and I will send them to the professor. Thank you all for taking the time to watch.